If you don't make payment now, we cannot start the operation. The nurse's voice cut through the small village clinic like a knife. George stood in the corridor, barefoot and shaking, his hands dirty with dried mud from the farm. His shirt was torn at the shoulder. Sweat ran down his face, not from the sun this time, but from fear. Inside the theatre, his wife, Justina, lay on a narrow bed, weak and pale. Her eyes had rolled back earlier, and the doctor had rushed her in. Now time was running out. George's chest rose and fell fast. He looked at his pockets again, even though he already knew the truth. Nothing. Not enough. Not even close. He swallowed hard, staring at the hospital wall that had cracks like spider legs. A ceiling fan creaked like it might fall at any moment. Somewhere outside, a goat bleated. Life continued, yet for George, the world was about to end. "Ogre!" the nurse shouted again. "Your wife can die in the next hour." George's lips trembled. His knees almost gave way. He had sold his last bag of cassava 2 days ago, thinking it would be enough. But the tests, the drugs, the emergency, everything kept adding up like a mountain he could not climb. He pressed his palm on his forehead. "God, please," he whispered. Then his phone rang. George froze. The phone was old with a cracked screen. Most times it never rang. Nobody called him like that. He checked the screen. Unknown number. It rang once, twice. George stared at it like it was a snake. He didn't want to pick. What if it was bad news? What if someone was calling to ask for money he didn't have? What if it was a distraction from the only thing that mattered? His wife's life. The phone rang a third time. The nurse yelled again, "Last warning, payment first." George's fingers shook as he finally pressed the green button. "Hello?" he said, his voice thin. A calm, confident voice came from the other side. George's throat tightened. That voice, it was not a villager's voice. It was a city man's voice. The voice that still sounded like expensive perfume and air conditioning. "George," the voice repeated, "this is Christopher, the man with the white Rolls-Royce." George's eyes widened. His mind flashed back to that day in the bush, the opened bonnet, the sweat, the fear on a rich man's face, and the strange words George had said without thinking. "If you allow, I'll fix it." George's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Christopher continued, "I've been trying to reach you. I owe you my life." George's heart beat faster, because at that same moment, behind George, the nurse screamed, "Your wife will die if we don't start now." Christopher paused. "What is that?" Christopher asked sharply. "Why is someone shouting about death?" George tried to speak, but his throat was tight like a knot. He turned and saw the doctor walking toward him, face serious, eyes tired. George's voice broke. "Sir, I'm in the clinic. My wife, Justina, she needs operation. But I don't have money." There was silence. Then Christopher's voice came back, louder now, like a man who had made up his mind. "Give the phone to the doctor, now." George blinked. "Sir?" "Give the phone to the doctor," Christopher repeated. "Please." George's hand moved slowly, like he was dreaming. He stretched the phone toward the doctor. "Doctor, someone wants to speak with you." The doctor frowned and took the phone. "Hello?" George watched his face. At first, the doctor's eyes were hard, then the doctor's eyebrows lifted. Then his face changed, like someone just opened a door to hope. "Yes, sir," the doctor said carefully. "Yes, I understand." George's stomach twisted. What was happening? The doctor nodded again and again. "We will start. Immediately." "Thank you, sir." The doctor ended the call and looked at George. His tone had changed. "George, go and sit down," the doctor said. "We are starting the operation now." George's mouth fell open. "But the payment—" The doctor raised his hand. "It has been handled." George turned slowly, staring at the phone in his own hand again, like it was magic. His ears rang. Handled? How? He ran his fingers over his face, confused, and then the phone rang again immediately. George picked up fast. "Sir, Christopher." Christopher's voice was steady but emotional. "They will start now. I am sending money. Do not worry." George's eyes filled with tears so quickly he couldn't even stop them. Says, "Sir, I don't know. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," Christopher replied. "Just tell me the clinic name and the account details they gave you. I'll send it now." George's hands shook as he repeated the information. As soon as he finished, Christopher said, "Stay with her. I'll call again." The line went dead. George stood there, stunned, while nurses rushed past him into the theatre. The corridor that felt like a prison moments ago suddenly felt like a thin line between death and life. He leaned against the wall and slid down slowly until he was sitting on the floor. His whole body was trembling. He buried his face in his hands and cried, quietly, like a man who had been strong for too long. The sun had been hot that day too. Not hospital hot. Lagos hot. But this time, George was not in a clinic. He was on an untarred path near his farmland, walking home from the farm with a cutlass in one hand and a hoe on his shoulder. His clothes were rough and old, his slippers were worn down. His hair was dusty, his stomach was empty, but he kept walking because that was his life. Then he heard a strange sound. Not a goat, not a bird. A car engine, weak, struggling. Weak. George stopped and listened. The sound came from deeper inside the bush road, close to where his farm sat. Slowly, he walked toward it. And then he saw it. A white Rolls-Royce Cullinan, shining like a moving house, sitting helpless on the dusty road with its bonnet wide open. A man in an expensive suit stood beside it, sweating hard like he was being chased by fire. His tie was loose, his shirt was stuck to his back. His face was scared, not angry, not proud, scared. The man turned and saw George approaching. His eyes widened when he noticed the cutlass and hoe. He stepped back quickly. "Please," the man said, raising his hands a little, "please don't come closer." George frowned. "Ogre, I mean, I won't hurt you." The man's breathing was fast. George's eyes moved to the car, then back to the man. "What happened?" George asked in simple English. The man swallowed. "My car broke down. I was returning from the village. I went to see my sick mother. Now the car stopped. My phone network is weak here, and this place doesn't feel safe." George looked around. He knew this road. He knew what the man didn't know. This bush area was a trap for rich people who got stuck. Sometimes thieves hid here. Sometimes kidnappers watched cars like this. George stared at the Rolls-Royce again. Then he looked at the man. The man looked too clean and too expensive for this place. George lifted his cutlass slightly, not in a threat, but just to adjust his grip. The man flinched. George quickly lowered it and said something that even surprised himself. "If you allow, I will fix it for you. Just trust me." The man blinked like he didn't hear well. "You?" he asked. His eyes traveled over George's torn shirt and dusty trousers. "You can fix a Rolls-Royce." George's face stayed calm. "Car is car, sir, if you allow." The man hesitated. His eyes moved from the bush to George's, cutlass to the silent car, then to the empty road behind them. He swallowed hard. He had no choice. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "Please." George nodded once. "Bring spanner," he said. The rich man looked confused. "Spanner? I don't have—" George pointed into the boot area. "Check. Most people keep small kit." The man rushed to check, hands shaking, and brought a small toolkit. George knelt by the engine like a man greeting an old friend. He bent over the bonnet, focused. He tightened some parts. He checked the battery head. He pressed and adjusted something carefully. The rich man watched with wide eyes, sweating more. After a few minutes, George stepped back. "Start," George said. The man rushed into the driver's seat and turned the key. For 1 second, nothing. Then the engine roared back to life. The rich man froze. His mouth dropped open. He looked at George like George had just performed a miracle. George wiped his hands on his trousers and said, "Battery head loose. Next time, check this. And don't stay long here. This place is dangerous." The man jumped out of the car quickly, eyes still wide. You saved me," he said. George shrugged like it was small. "No problem." The man ran into the car, brought out a card, and held it out with both hands. "My name is Christopher," he said. "Port Harcourt. This is my card. Please, Give me your number." George gave his number, still not expecting anything. Christopher nodded slowly, like he was still in shock. "When I get back to Port Harcourt," Christopher promised, "I will call you. I will not forget this." Then he entered his Rolls-Royce, drove off fast, and disappeared down the dusty road. George watched the car leave. Then he picked his hoe again and continued walking home. He didn't know that this small moment inside the bush had just tied his life to a stranger's forever. Back in the present, George sat outside the operation room, staring at the closed door. His hands were clasped tightly, like a child praying. Inside that room, Justina's life was hanging by a thin thread. And somewhere in Port Harcourt, the billionaire who nearly died in a bush road was now paying to keep Justina alive. George's phone buzzed again. A message alert. George wiped his eyes and looked down. And what he saw on the screen made his heart stop. Because it wasn't just a payment alert. It was a message that said, "Transfer successful, but account reversed. Payment on hold." George sprang to his feet, panic hitting him like a wave. At that exact moment, the theatre door opened. And the doctor stepped out, with a face George could not read. George's voice cracked. "Doctor, how is my wife?" The doctor took a slow breath and said, "George, we have a problem. George, we have a problem." Those words landed on George's chest like a heavy stone. He could not breathe for a second. He could not blink. He could not even hear the clinic noise anymore. The crying baby outside, the footsteps, the ceiling fan creaking. Everything became quiet inside his head, like someone pressed a mute button on the world. George stepped closer to the doctor. His voice shook. "Doctor, please, talk to me. How is my wife?" The doctor looked tired. His forehead was shiny with sweat. His surgical cap sat crooked, like he had been moving fast. "She is still inside," the doctor said slowly. "We started, but we might have to stop." "Stop?" George repeated like he did not understand the word. The nurse behind the doctor frowned and crossed her arms. She was the same nurse who had shouted at George earlier. Her face was hard like stone. "The payment alert we received," the doctor continued, "it showed successful. But now the account is saying payment on hold. That means the transfer has not settled." George's legs turned, weak. But you said it was handled," George whispered. "You said you will start immediately." "We did," the doctor replied, voice firm, "because we believed the money was coming, but the clinic owner is insisting we cannot continue unless it clears." The nurse snapped, "This is not charity hospital." George's eyes filled again. "Please," George begged, "please don't stop. My wife, she will die." The doctor looked at him, and for a moment his face softened. He was not a wicked man. He was just stuck between rules and a life. "George," he said, "I understand, but the theatre has costs, drugs, blood, the surgeon. We can't run this place on promises." George's hands trembled as he grabbed his phone. He stared at the message again. "Transfer successful, but account reversed, payment on hold." George didn't even fully understand what it meant. All he knew was this. If the money didn't go through, Justina might not come out alive. He pressed Christopher's number and called. It rang. Once, twice. Christopher picked quickly. "George." "Sir," George cried. "Sir, the clinic said payment is on hold. They want to stop the operation. Please, please." Christopher's voice changed instantly. "What?" "Put the doctor on the phone again." George pushed the phone forward with shaking hands. The doctor took it and said, "Hello, sir?" Christopher's voice came out sharp and controlled, like a man used to handling emergencies. "Doctor," Christopher said, "I transferred the money. I have the confirmation." Doctor sighed. "We saw it. But the clinic account is showing on hold. That means we don't have it yet." Christopher paused. "Give me 5 minutes." The doctor frowned. "Sir, we are in the middle of surgery. We don't have 5 minutes to waste." Christopher's voice became even stronger. "Doctor, listen to me. I will not let that woman die because a bank system is slow. Keep going. I am sending another payment now from a different account. A direct transfer." The doctor glanced at the nurse, who rolled her eyes as if she didn't believe big promises. Christopher added, "And if you stop, and anything happens to her, you will answer to me directly. I will hold you responsible. Do you understand?" The doctor swallowed. George's heart pounded. A rich man's anger could shake a whole village. George had seen it before, how money could make people act fast. The doctor cleared his throat. "All right, sir, but we need proof now, something that confirms it is real." "You will have it," Christopher said. "Now." The call ended. The doctor handed George the phone. "George," he said quickly, "go and sit. If the transfer comes in, we continue without interruption." George nodded, but he could not move. His body felt like wood. He watched as the doctor turned and disappeared back into the theater. The door closed. George stood outside, staring at that door like it was the gate of heaven. Then he heard it. A faint sound from inside. Not a normal sound. A sharp, alarm-like beeping, quick and loud. The nurse beside him rushed toward the door, peeking through the small glass. Her face changed. "Ah!" George's breath caught. "What? What is it?" The nurse didn't answer him. She ran inside. George stumbled forward, pressing his hands on the door. "Please," he shouted. "Please tell me, is she okay?" No one answered. The beeping continued. George's knees hit the floor, right there, on the cold clinic tiles. He folded his hands like a child and cried quietly, "God, please." Then his phone buzzed. A new alert message popped up. George's fingers shook as he opened it. His eyes widened. It was a clinic account alert screenshot sent by Christopher, not even from the bank, but a message that said, "I've sent a second. Transfer. Confirm with them now." George scrambled to his feet and rushed to the receptionist desk. The receptionist, an older woman with thick glasses, looked annoyed. George pushed the phone screen toward her. "Ma, please check. He has sent another one." The woman adjusted her glasses and logged into the clinic's phone. She stared at the screen, then stared again. Then her eyes widened slightly. She murmured. "This one, it has entered." George's whole body loosened like a rope that had been pulled tight for hours. "It has entered," he repeated. "Yes," she said, nodding. "It has entered. I will tell the theatre." George didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so he did both. A small sound escaped his mouth, half sob, half joy. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you, Jesus." He turned and ran back to the theatre door, but before he reached it, the door opened again. This time the doctor stepped out slowly. His gloves were stained. His face was serious. George froze again. "Doctor," George said. "Doctor, how—" The doctor raised a hand to calm him. "Sit down," he said. George sat quickly on the bench, his heart beating like a drum. The doctor pulled off his mask and breathed out deeply. "We almost lost her," he said. George's eyes widened. The doctor continued, "There was heavy bleeding. Her blood pressure dropped fast. We had to act quickly. We had to use extra blood, extra drugs. That's why the clinic was pushing for payment, because it became bigger than we planned." George's mouth opened, but he couldn't speak. The doctor looked at him, voice softer now. "But she is stable now." George's whole body shook. She is stable?" The doctor nodded. "Yes, she is not awake yet, but she is stable. We will move her to recovery." George's face twisted with relief so strong he couldn't even control it. He covered his mouth and cried. Again. Not the crying of fear, the crying of a man who almost lost the only person who truly loved him. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." The doctor patted his shoulder. "She is strong, but she will need care." "I will do anything," George said fast. "Anything." The doctor looked at him. "Good, because she will need rest, and you must also watch your own health. You look like you haven't eaten." George gave a small nod, but his mind was not on food. His mind was on Christopher, the billionaire, the stranger who had saved his wife's life from far away. George stood up and walked outside the clinic into the fresh village air. The sun was already setting. Orange light covered the trees and the dusty road. Children ran past, playing with a torn ball, unaware that a life had just been rescued inside that small building. George dialed Christopher's number again. Christopher picked immediately. "George," Christopher said, voice calmer now. "Any update?" George swallowed hard. "Sir," he said, "Sir, they said she is stable. They said she will survive." Christopher exhaled, like he had been holding his breath too. "Thank God." George sniffed. Sir, I don't know what I did to deserve this. You saved my wife's life. You paid. Christopher interrupted gently. George, you saved my life first. That day in the bush. You don't understand what you did. George frowned. Sir, I only fixed a car. No, Christopher said, voice firm. You saved a man who could have been kidnapped or killed. That place you warned me about? I later found out there was an attack on that road 2 hours after I left. A businessman was taken. George's heart jumped. Taken, he whispered. Yes, Christopher replied. If you had not fixed my car quickly, that could have been me. George's mouth went dry. So it was true. That bush was truly dangerous. Christopher continued, George, my driver keeps telling me to forget it, that you were just doing your job. But I can't forget. I keep hearing your words in my head. If you allow, I'll fix it. George's eyes filled again. Christopher added, Tell me what you need now. Food? Drugs? More payment? George hesitated. His pride tried to rise, but his wife had almost died because of pride. So he spoke honestly. Sir, they said we will still need money for drugs and follow up. And I haven't even paid for the blood they used. Christopher said immediately, Send me the total. I will handle it. George's voice broke. Sir, and George, Christopher added, when your wife recovers, I want to see you. Not on the phone, face to face. George blinked. See me? Yes, Christopher said. I'm sending my driver to your village when she is strong enough to travel. I want you and your wife to come to Port Harcourt. George's heart pounded. Port Harcourt? To a billionaire's house, his mind couldn't carry it. But Christopher's voice was not joking. I will call you tomorrow, Christopher said. Rest now, stay with her. The line ended. George stood outside the clinic, staring at the darkening sky. For the first time in many months, hope entered his chest. Not small hope, big hope, the kind of hope that could change a whole life. He turned back and walked into the clinic. Justina was now in recovery, breathing slowly, eyes still closed. George sat beside her bed, holding her hand softly. Justina, he whispered, you will live. You will see better days. Her fingers moved slightly, like she heard him. George smiled through tears, and then, as the night grew quiet, his phone buzzed again. Another alert. George opened it, and his eyes widened so much it hurt. Because the message was not just payment for hospital bills, it was a new transfer, and the amount was so big, George thought his eyes were lying. N5,000. 5 million naira. George's mouth fell open. His hand started shaking again. He looked up at his sleeping wife, then back at the alert. Then he saw another message from Christopher. This is not a loan. This is your second chance. Don't waste it. George's breath caught. He had never held 5 million in his whole life. Never. Not even close. And yet, here it was. His heart raced with joy and fear at the same time, because he suddenly realized something. If a billionaire gave you money like this, it meant your life was no longer normal. And somewhere in that gift, there could be tests, enemies, and trouble. As George sat there, still in shock, he didn't notice the shadow that stopped at the doorway of the recovery room. Someone stood there quietly, watching him. Watching the phone. Watching the money alert, and the person's voice came low and dangerous. So, this is where the money came to. George turned sharply, and his blood ran cold. So, this is where the money came to. The voice was low, slow, and sharp. George turned quickly, his heart jumping into his throat. Standing by the doorway was Bala, Justina's distant cousin, tall, lean, with eyes that never smiled even when his mouth did. He wore a faded jacket and slippers, but his posture was alert, too alert for someone visiting a sick relative. George's fingers tightened around his phone. Bala, George said carefully, you scared me. Bala stepped fully into the room and glanced at Justina on the bed. She was still sleeping, her chest rising and falling gently. Then his eyes dropped to George's phone screen, which still showed the N5000 alert. Bala whistled softly. 5 million, he said. Ah, God is wonderful. George locked his phone and slid it into his pocket. My wife nearly died, he said. This is not time for jokes. Bala raised both hands. Easy, easy. I'm not joking. I'm happy for you. Truly. But his eyes said something else. George had known Bala long enough to read that look. Greed. Silence filled the room for a few seconds. The only sound was the weak hum of the recovery machine. Bala broke it. So, who sent it? George hesitated. He remembered Christopher's words. Your life is no longer normal. A friend, George said. Bala laughed. A friend that sends 5 million? George, don't insult my brain. George's jaw tightened. It's not your concern. Bala's smile faded. We are family. George stood up slowly. Family doesn't show up only when money appears. That hit Bala. His face hardened. Careful, Bala warned. You talk like you've already forgotten where you came from. George felt heat rise in his chest. I haven't forgotten anything. I only refuse to let this money destroy us. Bala leaned closer, lowering his voice. You think money won't bring eyes, questions, people. George, when poor people suddenly get rich, trouble follows. George met his stare. Then I will face it. Bala stepped back and shrugged. Fine, I've said my own, but remember, people will ask, and not everyone will ask nicely. With that, Bala turned and walked out. George exhaled slowly. He looked back at Justina and brushed his thumb gently over her fingers. I won't let anyone ruin this, he whispered. Justina woke up slowly, like someone rising from deep water. Her eyes fluttered open, confused at first. Then she saw George sitting beside her, his head bent forward, asleep on the chair. George, she whispered. He jerked awake immediately. Justina! He stood up fast. You're awake, thank God. Her lips curved into a weak smile. I thought I was gone. George shook his head, tears filling his eyes. No, you're here. You're strong. She squeezed his hand lightly. What happened? George swallowed. I'll tell you everything, but first, rest. She nodded slowly. The doctor later confirmed it. Justina was recovering well. She would need rest, good food, and follow-up treatment, but the danger had passed. That evening, George stepped outside the clinic to take a call. It was Christopher. How is she? Christopher asked. She's awake, George replied. She spoke today. Good, Christopher said warmly. That's very good. George hesitated. Sir, thank you for the money. The 5 million. It's too much. Christopher chuckled lightly. George, when a man saves your life, there is no too much. But listen carefully. George straightened. I didn't send that money for you to sit on it, Christopher continued. I sent it so you can stand again. George frowned. Stand? Yes, Christopher said. You told me that day you fixed my car like it was nothing. You moved like someone who knew engines very well. George paused. I used to be an automobile mechanic, George said slowly, before the fire. The fire? Christopher asked. George's voice dropped. My workshop burned down 2 years ago. Electrical fault. Everything gone. Tools, cars, savings. After that, farming was the only thing left. There was a brief silence. Then Christopher said, When Justina is strong enough, I will send my driver. I want you both in Port Harcourt. George's heart skipped. Sir, Port Harcourt? Yes, Christopher said. I want to hear your story properly, face to face. George nodded, even though Christopher couldn't see him. All right, sir. Justina was discharged. The village gathered around them when they returned home. Some came with smiles, some with questions, some with envy hiding behind greetings. Bala stood among them, watching quietly. 2 days later, a black luxury SUV drove into the village, raising dust and attention. Children ran after it. Neighbors whispered. The driver stepped out, tall and neat, wearing sunglasses. George? He asked. Yes, George replied. My boss sent me, the driver said. Pack your things. You and your wife. We're going to Port Harcourt. Justina held George's arm tightly. Is this real? She whispered. George nodded, though his heart was racing. It is. As they packed a small bag, Bala appeared again. So it's true, Bala said. You're leaving. For a while, George replied. Bala leaned closer. Be careful, George. Big men don't help for nothing. George looked him in the eye. Sometimes kindness pays kindness. Bala scoffed softly. We'll see. The drive to Port Harcourt felt like a dream. Tall buildings replaced trees, smooth roads replaced dust. The air felt different. When the SUV finally stopped in front of a massive gated mansion, Justina gasped. "George," she whispered. "Where are we?" The gate opened slowly. Inside was beauty George had only seen on TV. The driver turned to them. "Welcome, my boss is waiting." George took Justina's hand. As they stepped out of the car, a man walked toward them from the entrance. Tall, calm, well-dressed. Christopher. Their eyes met, and before Christopher could say a word, George noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Behind Christopher, standing slightly aside, was a man in a dark suit. Holding a file, the same man George had seen once before, at the clinic. Watching. Christopher smiled and opened his arms. "George, welcome." But George couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was not just about gratitude anymore. Because some second chances come with tests, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The mansion doors closed softly behind George and Justina, but the sound echoed loudly in George's chest. Everything inside looked unreal. The marble floor shined like water. A chandelier hung above them like frozen sunlight. The air smelled clean, like calm and money mixed together. Justina held George's hand tightly. "I feel like I will stain something if I touch it," she whispered. George gave a nervous smile. "Just walk gently." Christopher laughed lightly as he led them into the large living room. "Relax. This house is not a museum. You are safe here." George nodded, but his eyes kept moving. He noticed cameras, quiet security men, and that same man in a dark suit, still standing a few steps away, holding a file and watching him closely. Christopher noticed George's glance. "That's Mr. Edwin," Christopher said, "my legal advisor." Mr. Edwin nodded politely but did not smile. Christopher gestured for them to sit. "Please." They sat on a soft couch that felt like it could swallow them. Christopher sat across from them. For a moment he said nothing. He just studied their faces, George's worn hands, Justina's thin frame, the marks of hardship that money could not hide. Then Christopher spoke. "George," he said calmly, "tell me everything. From the beginning." George took a deep breath. He talked about his childhood as an orphan, about learning mechanics from an old roadside technician, about saving little money to open his own workshop, about the fire that destroyed everything, about turning to farming just to survive. As George spoke, Justina listened quietly, nodding sometimes, wiping her eyes at others. Christopher did not interrupt. When George finished, the room was silent. Christopher leaned back slowly. "You know," he said, "people think wealth comes from luck, but real wealth comes from skill and character." George lowered his head. "Sir, I only did what I could that day." Christopher shook his head. "No, you chose to help when you could have walked away. You saw danger and still stayed." Christopher stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city. "I was sweating in that bush, not just because of the heat," he continued. "I was afraid, truly afraid. And when I saw you coming with a cutlass, I thought my life had ended." George swallowed. "But then," Christopher said, turning back, "you spoke with respect. Not fear, not anger, just honesty." He walked closer to George. "So here is why I brought you here," Christopher said. George's heart pounded. Christopher snapped his fingers gently. Mr. Edwin stepped forward and opened the file. Inside were documents. Christopher pointed to them. "George, I want to give you back what the fire took from you." George frowned. "Sir?" "I will build you a workshop," Christopher said clearly. "Not a small one, a proper automobile workshop, the biggest in Port Harcourt." Justina gasped. George stood up immediately. "Sir, no, this is too much." Christopher raised his hand. "Sit." George sat slowly, shaking. "I am not giving you money to waste," Christopher continued. "I am giving you an opportunity to work, to rebuild, to stand again." George's eyes filled with tears. "Sir, why me?" Christopher smiled softly. "Because when my life depended on you, you did not ask who I was. You only asked if I would allow you help me." Silence fell again. Justina covered her mouth, crying quietly. George could barely breathe. Mr. Edwin cleared his throat. There are conditions. George's heart jumped. Christopher nodded. Yes. Conditions. George straightened. I am listening. Christopher's tone became serious. The workshop will be in your name. You will manage it, but I will invest fully. Land, equipment, staff. George nodded slowly. You must run it honestly, Christopher continued. No cheating customers, no cutting corners, no illegal dealings. I swear, George said quickly. Christopher raised a finger. And one more thing. George waited. You will be tested. George frowned. Tested. Christopher glanced briefly at Mr. Edwin. There are people watching, Christopher said. People who believe kindness is weakness. People who think you will fail. George felt a chill. Christopher stepped closer and placed a hand on George's shoulder. George, this city will test you harder than that bush road. Money will test you. Power will test you. People will test you. George nodded slowly. I understand, sir. Christopher smiled again. Good, because the workshop will be ready in 1 month. Justina let out a small cry of joy. 1 month? George whispered. Christopher nodded. 1 month. The sun was bright over Port Harcourt. A crowd gathered outside a massive new building with a wide gate and shiny signboard. Cars lined the road. People whispered. Who owns this place? They say it belongs to that billionaire. Christopher. No, they say a poor mechanic owns it. George stood beside Justina, wearing a clean shirt and trousers that still felt strange on his skin. In front of them was the workshop. Large, beautiful, real. Christopher stood beside George, smiling. George, he said, today your life changes officially. George's hands trembled as he held the ribbon scissors. Justina squeezed his hand. Christopher nodded. Go ahead. George cut the ribbon. The crowd cheered. Tears ran freely down George's face. Cameras flashed. Applause filled the air. But as George stepped inside the workshop for the first time, touching the tools, smelling the oil, feeling whole again, he noticed something. At the back of the crowd, Bala stood there, watching, smiling slowly, and beside him was a man George had never seen before. The man leaned toward Bala and whispered something. Bala nodded. George's joy dimmed slightly because he suddenly understood. One thing, his second chance had officially begun. And so had the danger that came with it. The cheers slowly faded. People began to leave the new workshop, still talking excitedly about what they had seen. Some shook George's hand. Some praised Christopher. Some only stared, trying to understand how a poor village farmer had suddenly become the owner of the biggest automobile workshop in Port Harcourt. George smiled and thanked everyone, but his eyes searched the crowd. Bala was gone. The man who had stood beside him was gone too. George felt a small tightness in his chest, but he pushed it aside. Today was not a day for fear. That evening, after the crowd had left and the workshop lights were turned off, Christopher invited George into his private study inside the mansion. The room was quiet. Books lined the walls. A soft lamp glowed on the table. Sit, Christopher said gently. George sat, his hands resting on his knees like a student before a teacher. Christopher poured 2 glasses of water and handed one to George. You did well today, Christopher said. Thank you, sir, George replied. I still feel like I'm dreaming. Christopher smiled. Good dreams still require responsibility. George nodded. Christopher leaned forward. George, I want you to hear this clearly. Everything you have now, this workshop, this respect, can grow or disappear. George listened closely. People will test you, Christopher continued. Some will come pretending to help. Some will try to use you. Some will push you to cut corners. George's mind flashed to Bala. I will not fail, George said quietly. Christopher studied him for a moment, then nodded. That's why I chose you. George swallowed. Sir, may I ask you something? Go ahead. Why didn't you just give me money and forget everything else? George asked. Why go this far? Christopher smiled slowly. Because money changes people too fast. Work changes them properly. George understood. That night, George and Justina stayed in a guest room in the mansion. Justina lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. George, she whispered, promise me something. George turned toward her. Anything. Promise me that no matter how big you become, you will not forget the man you were in that bush. George reached for her hand. I promise. Port Harcourt had changed, and so had George. But not in the way people expected. George Auto Works became the most trusted automobile workshop in the city. Not because it was the biggest, but because it was the most honest. Drivers came from far places just to fix their cars there. Rich men, poor men, taxi drivers, even government vehicles. George treated them all the same. He wore simple clothes. He still greeted his workers by name. He still worked with his hands. Slowly, the business grew, then faster. George bought a comfortable house, not flashy, but strong and warm. Later, he bought an SUV, not to show off, but to move around safely. People started calling him chairman. George corrected them. Call me George. Christopher watched everything quietly from a distance. One afternoon, Christopher visited the workshop unannounced. He found George under a car, tightening something, oil on his hands. Christopher laughed. You still do this yourself? George slid out and smiled. I must not forget where my strength comes from. Christopher nodded in approval. That same year, something else happened. Justina became pregnant. The news spread joy through their home. George prayed every night, after years of waiting, fear, and hope. A baby boy was born, strong, healthy, crying loudly like he was announcing himself to the world. George held the child in his arms, tears rolling freely. Justina smiled weakly from the bed. What will we name him? George did not hesitate. Christopher. Justina's eyes widened. After him? Yes, George said softly, but not because he is rich. Then why? She asked. George looked down at the baby. Because he proved something to me, George said. That kindness can save lives and change destinies. When Christopher heard the news, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, George, I don't deserve that. George replied calmly, it was never about deserving. It was about doing. On a quiet evening, George stood alone outside his workshop as the sun went down. Cars passed. Life moved. He remembered the bush road, the broken Rolls-Royce, the fear in Christopher's eyes, and the simple words that started everything. If you allow, I'll fix it. George smiled to himself, because he finally understood the truth. It was not the car he fixed that day. It was a life. And in fixing that life, God fixed his too.